So what was next for the show? Well, Stephen Moffat then took over, and I would say that he was a bit like Hinchcliffe, following on from Barry Letts, in that he kind of his. If you look at Series 5, it seemed that he was a bit keener to try and get back to much more apolitical classic Doctor Who, in which it wasn't really about any kind of political agenda. It was just about, Doctor Who was a kind of a childhood family fantasy, very fairy tale. And I suppose for a lot of fans, a lot of the younger fans who kind of grown up on Russell T Davies, some of them were not so keen on this change. They kind of felt it was a change too far, and they couldn't quite articulate why, but it just felt too different to them. It was around this time that you had this kind of Tumblr feminism kind of crept onto the scene, and it seemed to appeal to a lot of the young female fans who were really struggling with Moffat's era. They were watching the era and they just felt they weren't really connecting with it emotionally like they used to, and they couldn't quite put into words why. But yet, Tumblr feminism was all about kind of theorizing all these ways that, well, the reason you're not relating to it is because Moffat is a bit of a chauvinist who doesn't really value the female perspective. So that's the reason why you're not able to relate to Amy the way you were able to relate to Rose, because Amy's not much of a character. She's just there to be, Moffat's kind of, male fantasy figure. And so Moffat did start to face much more of a feminist backlash. And it wasn't just, this new generation of fans. There was also the old guard as well. People like Paul Cornell were just starting to really start to rail against Moffat at this point. Like, I was kind of disgusted when Peter Capaldi had only just been cast, and I think Paul Cornell had gone and tweeted, in disgust of, you're not another white male as the Doctor. It's like Capaldi had only just been cast, and already, Paul was just pouring scorn on the decision and said, well, not woke enough. Moffat needs to do better suddenly. I mean, I don't know quite why it was intensifying like it was in the 2010s. I don't know. But it certainly did intensify, and obviously after Savilgate, the BBC was certainly keener to clean up its image in the face of any kind of radical opposition by kind of women's groups, by feminists. The institution was vulnerable now to ideologues who just hated masculinity, and this wokeness was everywhere. And so I think, we did get a lot more, radical feminist messaging because the Democrats were going with Hillary Clinton as their candidate. And it was the idea that, this would be historic if America could elect its first female president. And so, it did seem like a lot of Hollywood was behind this, was behind the idea of, vote Hillary, the future is female, we need a female president. So it got pushed heavily. And of course, then Hillary lost to Trump, and that just emboldened Hollywood with the idea that they now had to preach that message even more because clearly the audience didn't get it enough. And so, he gets filmed like The Last Jedi and Terminator Dark Fate, which just seemed to be kind of, just majorly doubling down on the feminist messaging and the disdain for men, disdain for old male heroes. And, men had to be taught to have less of an ego about things and just to submit to the female boss a lot more. And it just led to a really, really horrible period of cinema, which is still going on now. And it seemed like, no lessons were being learned. These franchises were going woke and going broke. And it played very much into Doctor Who. There was now a major demand for a female Doctor. It was clear, of course, that with Peter Capaldi, it was clear that Capaldi had wanted to stay on, and yet in interviews it was clear that he'd kind of chosen to leave before he was pushed, if you know what I mean. It was clear that the BBC just wanted him out, and certainly a lot of the feminists, they wanted the male Doctor gone, and they wanted a female Doctor in his place. That's all they wanted. And so it felt like Capaldi was just being charted off as, yesterday's rubbish. But this was what Chibnall wanted. He wanted a clean new broom, and so did the BBC. They wanted to kind of relaunch the Doctor Who era with a brand new face, a female face. And they were going to go the woke direction, and it was clear from the PR they were going for the feminist message. We're breaking the glass ceiling here, and we're going to really shake up the chauvinistic older generation fans who are used to the Doctor being a man. It did seem like, in a way, the PR was basically about the media storm that this would create from Doctor Who fans. Now, I think for me, where I realised it wasn't working, I began to realise it wasn't working, it was the episode The Ghost Monument where it became clear. Like, there's this scene where Jodie and her companions are being shot at by these sniper robots, and Ryan finds this discarded gun, and he's about to start shooting the sniper robots, and Jodie puts a foot down and says, "You're not using that gun. I don't believe in using guns." This is all while they're being shot at. And this was ridiculous. Like, it's like these are robots. These aren't these. They're not sentient life forms. There's no moral dilemma in fighting back, using a gun to fight back. But it's like, the Doctor's just deciding you're forbidden, and it just made the Doctor seem like an idiot. It made the tension of the scene fall flat, because it's like, well, I'm supposed to believe they're in danger, but there's time for the Doctor to make this sanctimonious speech about right and wrong. And I did very much get the sense that the reason she was being written this way was it was just, in a way to try and convince us all that she's still the same Doctor of old. Because the Doctor was always talking about guns being bad. So, she's going to do the same thing. But it was like, because this was a female Doctor now, you had to kind of go that bit further with that kind of nonsense. And so, yeah, I felt it wasn't really working. Then there was the episode Rosa, which, basically the episode Rosa is about Rosa Parks, the civil rights activist who made history when she took a stand against the racial segregation laws in Mississippi. The plot of Rosa, of course, is that the Doctor and her companions have to deal with this time-travelling figure called Krasko, who has come back in time specifically to prevent that happening. He's come to sabotage that political event so that the civil rights movement fails. And Krasko is a bit of a mystery at first. You're not quite sure who he is, what his agenda is, what he's creeping around for. And you spend most of the story hoping that his motives aren't going to be revealed to be the most obvious ones imaginable. But in the end, they are. He's revealed to be just a racist. A racist who comes from the future, and who's come back in time to prevent a future society based on racial equality from happening. He wants to ensure that black people are kept down, are kept oppressed, because he just hates black people. Now, this really doesn't make sense, because Krasko is supposed to come from the future we saw in Russell T Davies's era, and there's no real explanation for why Krasko has the racist attitude he does, and it completely contradicts what we've seen so far of the future of New Who, in which humans are going to grow up in a much more multicultural society where they're so marinated in it that it's a non-issue. Everyone in this future time is going to be colorblind. Racism is going to be a thing of the past. It's not going to be an issue for them. Environmentally, they're just too used to diversity to care about it. And it's very much presented that that's going to work out fine. Which is why it just makes no sense why Krasko would have the racist attitudes he does if he came from that kind of society. Where did he suddenly where does anyone from this future start to suddenly hate black people? But moreover, why is someone from this utopian society, why is someone from this future society come to despise that utopia so much that they're willing to make such a drastic change to the timeline just to prevent it happening? Now, the usual defenders of the story have always said, well, look, Krasko's racist, racism is irrational, his motives are supposed to be irrational, you're not supposed to see rationale in his motives. But you need to believe in his motives. And the thing is, he's not just a racist in the same way that the regular people of Mississippi are in this story. You see these racist characters, and they make sense as being racist because they've been marinated in a racist culture. and a racist worldview, but none of them would be as extreme as Kraskow in the sense that none of them would, make such a radical change to the timeline just to make things more racist. None of them would risk, altering whole generations of their own family line to enact their racist worldview. None of them would go that far. Kraskow, there's no effort to explain why Kraskow is willing to go that far. Why anyone would be willing to go that far. And unfortunately, it begs so many questions, and it really kind of brings to the fore the problem, which is that we know that actually Russell's utopian future is not coming true.
But when these European countries started letting folks in, every opportunist imaginable from surrounding countries came out of the woodwork to take advantage of the kindness of these European countries. As you'd imagine, a lot of these so-called economic migrants are criminals, thugs, extremists, people who will do whatever they like to anybody they like. Some of them have fake passports, fake documents suggesting that they are Syrian, when they've never even been to Syria. It seems entirely plausible that migrants committing rapes and molestation in refugee camps and asylum centers would do those same things to German women.
Between 80 and 100 women reported being sexually assaulted, with one reported being raped on New Year's Eve. These attacks were carried out by approximately 1,000 drunk and aggressive young men of North African and Middle Eastern descent. According to the first article that I read, what's particularly disturbing is that the attacks appear to have been organised. Around 1,000 young men arrived in large groups, seemingly with the specific intention of carrying out attacks on women.
This idea of, having this borderless, multicultural society, this borderless world, where there's no barriers, there's no kind of borders. We're seeing it play out. We're seeing, it play out with the disaster of the migrant crisis and Islamic terrorist groups getting a foothold in Europe and enacting horrific terrorist attacks. We're seeing that, this utopian vision in reality is a disaster. It's leading to horrific culture clashes. The architects of this supposed utopia are screwing everything up for the West. They're not making the third world better. They're making the West like the third world. We're heading for a terrible future. If you know that, then Kraskow kind of brings that to the fore because, by his willing commitment to prevent this utopian future happening, it kind of brings home to us that we're not heading for that utopia. It is going to be a disaster. It is going to be something deeply undesirable. It is turning into a dystopia. Because, in the absence of any kind of motives we're given, we can only look to the way things are going now for why someone would despise this utopia that we're supposedly on course for, but we know deep down we're not on course for it. But, the story just seems to adopt the attitude of, well, of course we're on course for it, and of course Kraskow's motives for wanting to prevent it, don't think of them as anything other than racist. You can't see, you're not supposed to see him any other way. You're not supposed to think there's any validity to what he's doing at all. What feels especially grotesque is the feeling that it's not just... Like, if it was just about the racism of the time, fair enough. It's an ugly truth, and ugly truths should be shown. But with Kraskow, it seems like the story is going beyond that into saying that, white people are always going to be the problem. They're always going to be the hateful ones. They're always going to be the perpetrators of oppression and bigotry and hatred. The problem is always going to be the evil white man. The evil racist white man. And this is especially crass at a time when we just had the Islamic State and horrific human rights abuses in the Middle East. It's like the story is pretending that those horrors don't happen. The only horrors that ever happen on the world stage are the fault of the white man. So Chibnall had allowed the show to kind of go more political. Now, I did say that I'd always viewed Chibnall as just someone who was keen to follow the popular trends of the day. I mean, in interviews, he even said that he felt that that the show had to go with a female doctor because if they didn't, then the show was likely to be seen as left behind. It would have been seen as kind of, behind the times. I certainly remember at the time thinking that doesn't make sense. because it wasn't that long ago, back in 2013, that you had, the Day of the Doctor got huge ratings, massive ratings because there was a general audience that would love David Tennant as the Doctor, and were really excited to see him back, and it's like, are we going to pretend that that audience never existed, and that now, the fans who'd adored him are suddenly going to be disgusted at the idea of the Doctor being another white male? It just rang hollow to me. I just thought, there's no way that viewers who absolutely love David Tennant as the Doctor have suddenly en masse become man-haters. But Chibnall went with the direction he did. But, like I said, I didn't think it was based on anything other than following the crowd. I didn't think he was necessarily any kind of ideologue. But I did hear rumours about the Timeless Children. I heard rumours that it was coming, and I erred on the side of caution by not watching it. In fact, I erred on the side of caution by not watching most of the season, really. But, I wasn't the only one who heard this rumour. I do remember someone telling me about someone, I had a contact who had a contact, shall we say. And, their contact worked in the Who shop in London. And, they got the scoop quite often from BBC Enterprises about what was coming, what the latest developments of the show were going to be. And they got word about the Timeless Children retcon that Chibnall was planning. And apparently they were trying to get word to BBC Enterprises of, look, can someone please persuade Chibnall not to do this? Can someone please explain to him, from me, if you do this, you're going to kill our sales, you're going to kill all interest in the show from the fan base. The fans are going to walk away. They're going to rage quit the show en masse if you do this. And yet, Chibnall went and did it. He did the Timeless Children. He retconned the entire origins of the Doctor, seemingly for no other reason than to reveal that the Doctor was not originally a white straight male. He wasn't originally William Hartnell. He'd had this secret past of all these hidden past regenerations, these past incarnations who've been every colour and every gender, and it was just ridiculous. It was a ridiculous retcon. It completely tarnished 50 plus years of Doctor Who canon. For what? And that's really my main contention with the Timeless Children retcon is, what was the need for it? I get that Jodie Whittaker had her fans, but who loved her era. But as far as I can tell, they would have loved that era just as much if the Timeless Children retcon never happened. If there'd been no Timeless Children retcon, they would not have loved her era any less, as far as I could tell. It just seemed to be done as an act of spite against the classic series fans. And indeed, an act of spite against the classic series as a show that started life with a white male hero. It's hard to understand. It's hard for me to understand why Chibnall went and did this, because I was still kind of having trouble with understanding the idea of Chibnall being any kind of a true believer. It just didn't sound like him to me. But then, he had been working in the BBC for many years now. So he was in an echo chamber of these very radical, very left-wing, very woke, champagne socialist type of views that brooked nothing but disdain for old British colonialism, old British tradition, old British nationalism. And that kind of translated into disdain for the show because it had a white male lead. See, I've sometimes mingled with kind of woke parents who will say that they feel that it's important to introduce their daughters, the young girls, to films like Captain Marvel, films like Black Widow, and Star Wars: The Force Awakens, which give us female heroes like Rey. And it very much comes across from these parents that they've really absorbed the idea that this media that's played this narrative that plays very much on their sense of parental guilt, that if they don't introduce their daughters to this kind of media, then they're selling their daughters short. They're letting their daughters down by not giving them empowering role models to look to. And it did feel in a way like this Chibnall's approach was just that idea gone berserk of, well, we need to encourage, all the nation's youth, black, white, male, female, that they can all be the Doctor, and present a story in which they've all been the Doctor. Every one of their demographic has been the Doctor at one point, and the Doctor isn't just an exclusively white male part, and it never has been. With Chibnall, I do kind of liken it to there's certain cases of jihadists, radical Islamists who went on a killing spree, maybe killed themselves in the process. But they were possessed of this, this radical, sanctimonious ideological belief that they had a duty to Allah to murder scores of unbelievers. But sometimes you actually look at the background of these jihadists, and it doesn't add up. You actually look at, there's a long period of their life where religion was not important to them at all, in which they were actually living very kind of secular, hedonistic lives. Indulging in a lot of debauchery, a lot of drugs, drink, sex, that kind of thing. Just partying, and yet all of a sudden and they weren't really all that interested in religion or Islam, and then suddenly there came this period of their life where they suddenly became radicalized, and they suddenly became really pious. They suddenly started to really buy into the Islamic cause, and they started to get the idea that they could only atone for their sins, their past sins, their old life, which they were now ashamed of, by martyring themselves and killing unbelievers. And it's like, I know it's a bit of a crass analogy to make. Maybe it's a bit of a tasteless analogy to make, but it did feel almost like the same kind of thing was happening with Chibnall, where it was a case of he just rapidly was, by his environment in the BBC, was rapidly turned into a true believer that he'd never been before, and to the point where he was willing to essentially kamikaze the show for his ideology. This new ideology he bought into that very much played on a sense of white guilt. It was kind of hard to make sense of, but I think maybe that's what was going on. It was a case of just suddenly this ideology had completely taken over the industry, and Chibnall started to believe it in a way he never had before. Everyone was starting to believe it in a way they never had before. It was just everyone had drunk the Kool-Aid. YouTubers like The Rabbi and Nerdrotic, they do streams in which they talked about the sorry state of Doctor Who, and they'd actually say that there are now warehouses, there are toy stores in America which are kind of, are full of these Jodie Whittaker action figures that are just collecting dust that they just can't give away. No one wants them. The kids aren't interested, and so they're just collecting dust. They're essentially fit for landfill now. And like, I'd listened to all these stories about, dwindling toy, about, dead toy sales, and I kind of thought, surely these people are exaggerating. It can't have just disappeared to nothing already. Like, because I remember going into Forbidden Planet back in the early 2010s, and and I remember, like, there was a big Doctor Who section there. There was a big section of Big Finish CDs and the DVDs and the magazines, and I used to love going to Forbidden Planet. I'd go to various Forbidden Planets across the country, to track down certain audios I wanted. I loved, shopping in Forbidden Planet for stuff, and, I'd long taken it for granted that the Doctor Who section was always going to be that big. It was always going to be this huge section of just, your choice destination of Doctor Who material was going to be here. And, you're going to discover new guidebooks, new audios. This was the place to go to look out for stuff. And then, I think one day, sometime after lockdown, I was kind of just starting to get used to going to town again. I went into my local Forbidden Planet, and I was shocked to realize that they were right. It was the Doctor Who section had been downsized into a small shelf. That's just how little Doctor Who material there was, and it just seemed like there was a dead interest in the show now. It had been just usurped by everything else now, and it's like, I never would have thought I'd see the day. I thought the show had been too big to shrink that much. And it did feel like it had happened very, very rapidly. That this diminishment of the franchise had been just it had been accelerated by Chibnall's approach. Like at this point, like I said, I co-moderated the forum, the Autumn Factory, with Graham. Because of that, I was kind of keeping track of the ratings of the show. I do remember in the lead up to Legend of the Sea Devils, I did think maybe this episode's going to do slightly better in the ratings. I mean, by that point, the ratings were down to the bedrock. They were getting lower and lower, and I did think maybe Legend of the Sea Devils would see a bit of a perk up in the ratings. They see a bit of a spike up in ratings. I thought, you know what, it's got a fairly good pitch, a fairly populous pitch. It's basically Pirates of the Caribbean with Sea Devils. You know, if you'd put a pitch like that out in the Russell T Davies era or the Moffat era, you would definitely get bums on seats. That would definitely get the crowd interested. Now, it's come maybe a bit too late, but people are probably going to be more interested. Fans are going to get more interested in that. It's the return of the Sea Devils, for God's sake. That's got to get the fans interested, hasn't it? So I expected it to do slightly better in the ratings. And then the ratings came in, and they were as low as ever. They didn't go up at all. And I do remember at the time getting quite upset about that. It was kind of poignant. It kind of hit me in the gut a bit that this was the damage was irreversible now. That, no one was interested in the show anymore. It was just dead. It was past its best, and there was no way the show could turn this around now. It was too late. I remember feeling kind of sad about that, really. And of course now we are where we are, and there are people with kind of inside information on the BBC who said that, what, if it wasn't for the return of Russell T Davies, if Russell hadn't approached the BBC and said, I'm willing to take on the show again, then there's a good chance that The Power of the Doctor, Jodie's final story, is probably where it would have ended. It probably would have been a case of the BBC saying, well, the show's not doing good in the ratings anymore. We're not really sure what to do with it. We might as well just end it until we get a better idea. It seemed like that might have been curtains for the show, really. So, why is it the fans are losing heart again? Well, I think lockdown changed many of us. It certainly changed me. It was a period in which I kind of became much more aware of the culture war because, we were locked down, we were online a lot more, we were communicating online a lot more, and much of our communications were about the culture war. And we all just saw it getting worse and worse. We saw the insanity of the BLM riots in America. We saw the overreach of the state in terms of arresting people who'd kind of protested against lockdown, and it was sinister, it was crazy, and the last 5 years have really changed us politically. Some of us who might have been on the left at one point are now going much more right-wing, and they've seen the left accelerating in their madness, and so many people are going more right-wing. And the worst thing is, if you're a convert to the right wing now, it all looks incredibly hopeless because it just seems like, the right wing have no power whatsoever anymore. Everything is stacked against them. There's no way of winning. And it was JT from the Space Book who said of on the podcast in which they discussed the casting of Jinx Monsoon, it was JT who said that right wing has become a scare word, and it shouldn't be, because he said, you know what, we need the right wing, we need the left wing, we need the right wing, we need balance between the two, we need an equilibrium between the two. And he said that he grew up in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher's government was in power, and it was a really horrible situation of seeing the right wing in power enacting very authoritarian measures and very authoritarian policies. He said it was terrible having the right wing in power. But now we were seeing the left wing in power, the radical left wing in power, and it was horrible. We were seeing them kind of, they were enforcing their ideology on everyone. They were, we were seeing people being arrested for offensive tweets. This really horrible propaganda being pushed, and these horrific ideas like the drag queen story hour for children. We were kind of seeing what the authoritarian left was all about now. And it was like, this is just as bad as the right wing being in power. In some ways, it's worse. And so he was saying, look, we need a balance between the two. We can't just have one dominate over the other. We can't just marginalize the right wing to the point where the left have all the power, because that's just a dystopian nightmare. Now, my view is that it's slightly worse than that. Because, as well as the left wing having that kind of power, we've also got this other wing, a very, very different right wing camp gaining power as well. And that's the Islamic religious right. And the Islamic religious right are crazy, they're intolerant, they're violent, and they're gaining more and more of a foothold in the West, particularly in Britain and Europe. And the problem is they are the enemy of everything that's progressive, everything the left should cherish, but the left are not our ally in that fight at all. So yeah, I do think things are worse, and it is looking like, we're facing an existential threat to the country. Certainly things are looking hopeless for the country. And I think that's the core issue of why, a lot of fans are giving up on Doctor Who. They've lost heart in the show. Because, like I said, it is true that the Doctor has long been a left-wing hero. Ever since the Silurians, he's been more or less a left-wing hero, and he's been increasingly more left-wing. And for many years, we've empathized with the Doctor. We've always kind of, believed that he stands for doing the right thing, and that we've always empathized with his moral mission and his moral journey. We've always been with him in that. It was easy to be on his side back then because he was raiding against the establishment. We could champion him as a rebel against a right-wing establishment. And at the same time, because the establishment was against him, we never had to worry about seeing what his left-wing policies would be like in action. He was no threat to the status quo, really. He wasn't a threat to the status quo that we had to worry about. We had the luxury of believing that it would all work out fine, as it always did in nearly every era of Doctor Who that Eric Seward had nothing to do with. And the problem is, of course, that now we're realizing that that's wrong. That actually we're seeing what a society based on the Doctor's left-wing principles is like. Violent, left-wing anti-fath thugs running rampant and being given free rein by the police. Rampant criminality given free rein by the police in the name of political correctness. We're kind of getting a rude awakening of what the Doctor's idealism would really lead to in real life. And it's horrible, and we can't get behind it anymore. And as a result, we can't get behind the Doctor anymore. We don't empathize with his or her moral mission anymore, because what the Doctor's fighting for now is the worst of the status quo. It's fighting for left-wing progressive ideals that are being enforced in a very authoritarian way now. So now we look back at the classic Pertwee stories and we think, you know what, we used to be behind the Doctor in his cause in the Green Death and the Silurians, but look what it's leading to now. No one ever put the brakes on this. It's a bit like this scene in Watchmen. Watchmen was this 2009 film by Zack Snyder, which was basically an adaptation of an old 1980s comic, superhero comic, graphic novel, about this group of Silver Age superheroes who were, they were Silver Age superheroes. They were very big and adored in the 1940s and 50s, when America was this really patriotic nation. And then the story progresses into the 1970s, where you've suddenly had this radical social change, and now it's the post counterculture years, and It's post-Vietnam, it's post-Watergate, and now everyone in society is disillusioned in America and the American state. They've seen how deep the rot of corruption lies in America, and they've seen just how evil, just how immoral America has been on the world stage during Vietnam. And so suddenly it's that question of, well, what do these Silver Age heroes stand for now? People responded to them back in the day because it was a more patriotic time, and these heroes were seen as representing that American ideal of the wholesome American hero on the world stage. And yet now everyone's disillusioned in that patriotism. So what do these heroes represent now? And it looks like to the people, all they represent now is the fascist arm of a criminal, corrupt American state. And so the public begin to despise the superheroes now.
What the hell happened to us? What happened to the American dream?
What happened to the American dream? It came true. You're looking at it.
And that line sums it up perfectly. It's sometimes ideals can turn into nightmares. Sometimes ideals can become realized as nightmares. The American dream of individualism, freedom, and self-determination, it can manifest in the worst way as as anarchy, as just people being a violent law unto themselves with no respect for law or anyone else. And it feels like we're realizing the same thing with Doctor Who, that this hero we thought we were on the side of, certainly he's not our hero now, when we feel we need a pushback against this horrible status quo, and yet we just know that this Doctor that we're being given on TV is all for this dystopian status quo. And we have to look elsewhere for heroes now, and so I think that's why fans are losing interest in the show now. Why fans have lost love of the show. I'm feeling it too. Even when I think back on old Pertwee episodes that I used to love, and which I still did love during lockdown, I'm now thinking I've gotten so far away from the ideals of this hero now. I used to be behind this hero, and I'm not anymore. I've woken up too much to the real world to go back to sleep, to go back to the fantasy idealism of the show now. The show we loved was always just a pipe dream, and we're getting a reality check now. Basically, times have changed, and those times have changed us as much as they've changed Doctor Who. And this is why we and Doctor Who are parting ways. It's almost against our will. We've started to feel like it's just we've nothing in common with the show anymore, and we certainly don't have common cause with the show anymore. It's getting harder to remember why we ever did. The culture war will get worse before it gets better, but I think many of us are not holding out hope for Doctor Who to become part of the remedy anymore. The time when it might have been is a long time ago now. Maybe back during the Sunmakers, maybe back during Earthshock. But the past is another country. Anyway, this is Sadako24, signing out.